Hi, welcome to our quick discussion of the body cavities. The body itself is the ultimate cavity. It's filled with cells and tissues and organs that all have a specific job or function to keep the body running and working well. But when we look inside the body, it's not just one big open sac with all the organs crammed in there. The body is actually very well organized. It's separated into smaller compartments that we call body cavities. And these body cavities or compartments each house specific organs. This is kind of like your house, right? Think about your house. You have this nice strong wall that forms the outer barrier for your house. Provides a lot of protection, right? It keeps the good stuff in and it keeps the bad stuff out. Now, when you go inside your house, there are typically additional walls that separate the house into separate rooms, and each room has its own designated function. For example, in the bathroom, you go to the restroom, you shower. In the kitchen, you cook food, right? Each of those separate compartments has its own separate function. Now in the body, again, it's the same way. We see the outer barrier of our body, but if you section the body and look inside, you'll see that there are smaller barriers or walls that divide the body up into body cavities. Now, there are multiple functions of the body cavities. The most obvious of these is that the body cavities provide protection for our organs. Right? There are additional or extra walls surrounding the organs that are frequently tough in nature, fibrous and strong, and that provides extra protection for the organs inside. For example, we'll see that the chest cavity here is called the thoracic cavity, and there's this strong wall that surrounds the thoracic cavity. It has bones, like the bones on your ribs, right? That's your thoracic cage. And there are muscles layered there. Provides a strong wall or barrier around the thoracic cavity to protect the organs that are inside. The body cavities also give the organs space. It gives the organs the room that they need to change in size and shape as they function. If you imagine if we just had all of our organs crammed in here and we just let them all sit, the organs would all drop down towards the bottom and they would squash each other. Everything would be all squished together and they wouldn't be able to function because many of our organs actually change in size and shape as they work. For example, think about your heart. The heart's job is to contract, right, to squeeze, and that pumps blood through the body. If you've ever seen a beating heart, for example, like on a TV show or on the internet, the heart moves quite a bit as it contracts and beats. It needs space to do that. If all of the other organs were just cramped all around it, it wouldn't have the room that it needs to contract. So it has its own little space, its own cavity that gives it the room it needs to function. The lungs, for example, as the lungs inhale or pull air in and then exhale to push air out, that is intimately related to changes in the size and shape of the body cavities. We have multiple organs that change size as they fill and empty. The stomach, for example, the stomach stretches quite a bit as we put a meal in it, right? We don't eat little tiny bits of food all day long. We don't graze all day. We sit down and we eat a nice sizable meal. Well, when we put that meal in the stomach expands or stretches out. It needs space to do that. Can you think of another organ that stretches and expands as we fill it up? The bladder, maybe, right? We can hold a lot of urine in the bladder at one time, but that means that the bladder needs space to expand as it fills with that urine. So body cavities provide protection for our organs, and they give the organs the space that they need to function properly. When we look at body cavities, as well as the organs that are inside of them, we see that the cavities and the organs are lined by what we call serous membranes. A membrane is like a lining, and serous membranes specifically are very thin, smooth linings that have the ability to produce fluid. So these serous membranes will line the body cavity and they'll line the organs that are inside, and they produce a serous fluid, and they fill the body cavity. They fill the space that surrounds the organs with serous fluid. Now this fluid is important because it provides lubrication. As the organs move, we don't want them to be rubbing up against the body wall or the cavity wall and generating friction. If you rub your hands together, really fast, or rub against your arm really, really fast, it gets hot very quickly and it starts to hurt. You start to wear away at the tissue. So imagine an organ like your heart. It beats all day, every day, for your entire life. If it was rubbing and generating friction every time it contracts, you would damage the heart tissue very fast. So having these really smooth, slick, moist membranes and having this lubricating fluid, serous fluid, surrounding the organ allows for the organ to slide and glide against the cavity wall without generating any friction. Now, when we look at these membranes, there are different serous membranes lining each of the cavities and associated with each of the organs. The three serous membranes that we'll look at are the pericardium, the pleura, and the peritoneum. The pericardium is the membrane that's associated with the heart. Now, when you look at that word, pericardium, you can see cardio in the middle. And if you think back to chapter 1 where we learned word roots, you guys should know that the root cardio means heart. So pericardium is the membrane that's associated with the heart, surrounds the heart. The pleura is the membrane that's associated with the lungs. And the peritoneum is the membrane that's associated with the abdominal organs. Or you could say the digestive organs. Now, each of these membranes, the pericardium, the pleura, and the peritoneum, each of them has two layers. They are two-layered membranes. The two layers are called the parietal layer and the visceral layer. So that means there's a parietal pericardium and a visceral pericardium. These two layers they're named according to whether they're lining the organ itself or they're lining the body cavity, the cavity wall. So the parietal layer, this is the outer layer, the layer that's lining the actual cavity wall. Then the parietal layer curves inward and it's continuous with the visceral layer. The visceral layer is the inner layer that lines or covers the actual organ itself. If this sounds confusing, don't worry, just go with me. I'm going to show you a lot of examples as we go. Okay? So we're going to go through all of the body cavities now, and as we go through the cavities, we'll look at the organs that are in each cavity and the membranes that line the cavities when applicable. So the body cavities are kind of like, those nesting dolls where you just see, one wooden doll and you open it and then there's a smaller one, and you open that and there's a smaller one, and you open that and there's a smaller one. The body cavities are kind of the same way. So the body itself is like the ultimate cavity. But then when we look inside, we see that the body is divided up into two smaller cavities. the dorsal cavity and the ventral cavity. And then if you open those, you see there are even smaller cavities, right? You open those and there are even smaller cavities. You get the point. So first we're going to look at the two large body cavities that are present, the dorsal cavity and the ventral cavity. From our directional terms, you guys should know that dorsal pertains to the back. Remember, on like a shark or a dolphin, the dorsal fin is the big fin that sticks off of the back, the one that you see sticking up. So dorsal pertains to the back. So the dorsal body cavity is the cavity that runs down the back. It starts up here in the skull and then continues down the vertebrae, the bones that form your spine down your back. So all of that I just circled, everything in orange, is the dorsal body cavity. Now, the dorsal body cavity can be separated into two smaller cavities, which you see here. The dorsal cavity includes the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity. The cranial cavity you see up top here. Cranial refers to the skull. So the cranial cavity is the cavity within the skull. Now, what organ do you think is inside the cranial cavity? Hopefully you said the brain. The brain is inside the cranial cavity. Now, the membranes that surround the brain are a little bit different than the other membranes. The membranes that surround the brain are called the meninges. And we'll talk about those a lot more at the very end of the semester when we talk about the brain. But the meninges are the membranes that surround the brain, specifically the cranial meninges. The vertebral cavity you see going down all of the vertebrae. There's a hole in the center of each of the vertebrae, and the holes all line up to create like a canal that goes up and down the back. Inside the vertebral cavity, we have the spinal cord. The spinal cord is very similar to the brain, and the membrane that surrounds the spinal cord, we also refer to as meninges. There are multiple layers. We refer to them as the meninges, but in this case, it's the spinal meninges. So the dorsal cavity includes the cranial cavity, which houses the brain and is lined by the cranial meninges. The vertebral cavity houses the spinal cord, and that's lined by the spinal meninges. That's it for the dorsal body cavity. It's pretty simple. The ventral body cavity, on the other hand, is quite a bit more complex. So we'll spend a lot more time talking about the ventral body cavity. Ventral, remember, refers to the belly side, right? The front side of the body. The ventral body cavity includes everything you see over here. So all of these other colors here, everything essentially in front of the spinal cord, or in front of the vertebral canal, you have the ventral body cavity. Now, the ventral body cavity is divided into top or superior and bottom or inferior portions, and it's divided by the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a huge dome-shaped muscle. There's a big muscle that kind of curves like this, and it almost completely separates the chest from the abdomen. There's only a couple little things that go through the diaphragm. It's a really big muscle that separates the top of the ventral body cavity from the bottom of the ventral body cavity. Everything above the diaphragm is in the thoracic cavity. The thoracic cavity is what we would refer to as the chest cavity. It's all of this stuff that's inside your rib cage. So in purple on this picture here, you see the thoracic cavity. In a second, we'll look inside the thoracic cavity and we'll look at all of the other stuff that's inside. For now, just understand that above the diaphragm is the thoracic cavity. Below the diaphragm is referred to as the abdominopelvic cavity. In the picture here, you see two subdivisions or two parts of the abdominopelvic cavity. The top of it is the abdominal cavity. That's what you see in pink. The bottom is the pelvic cavity. That's what you see in green. But the whole area together, right, all of this that's below the diaphragm is altogether called the abdominopelvic cavity. And you see where the name comes from, right? Abdominopelvic, because it's abdominal and pelvic. All right, guys, so we're going to look in more detail at the thoracic cavity or the chest cavity. Remember that the thoracic cavity is the area above the diaphragm. So if you look at this picture down here, this tissue, this is all showing you the diaphragm. So it's a big dome-shaped muscle that forms a big barrier between the chest cavity and the abdominal cavity. The thoracic cavity is all of this. So all of this tissue up here above the diaphragm is included in the thoracic cavity. And then when we open up the thoracic cavity, we'll see that it's got numerous cavities within it. It's separated into multiple other areas. So we'll start by looking at the pleural cavities. Inside the thoracic cavity on either side, so on like the outer sides, there's a right and a left pleural cavity. And these pleural cavities house the lungs. So the right pleural cavity has the right lung, the left pleural cavity has the left lung. Down here again in the picture, you can see the lungs themselves. So this here is the right lung. This one over here is the left lung. Keep in mind that right and left are always the subject's right and left, or the patient's right and left, not yours. So like when I look at this, I have to go crisscross in order to get the patient's right and left. You'll notice that in between the lungs right here, you guys see the heart. In a second, we'll look at the heart in the pericardial cavity. But right now, we'll focus on the lungs on either side. Remember that the lungs and the pleural cavity has a membrane present, and that membrane is called the pleura. These words, pleural cavity and pleura, are very similar to each other, so don't mix those up. Pleural cavity, pleura. When we look at the pleura, the membrane, remember that there are two layers. There's a visceral layer that's actually on the lungs, and then there's a parietal layer or an outer layer that's lining the actual like body wall. So let's look at the way that those kind of work. The visceral pleura, again, is the layer that's actually on the surface of the lungs. Forgive my terrible drawing, but this is supposed to be lining the lungs. Right, so that would be in green, the visceral pleura. And then that visceral pleura curves around and continues as an outer layer called the parietal pleura. You'll notice that they leave a space between them, right? The visceral pleura and the parietal pleura, there's a little bit of space between them. It's shown in light blue on this picture. And this space right here, that's the actual pleural cavity. That's the actual space that the lung has to function. Also, you'll notice that that's filled with fluid. Remember, we said that each of the cavities is filled with serous fluid. And that fluid provides lubrication. In this case, because the fluid is in the pleural cavity, we call it pleural fluid. If you look over here at this picture, the pleura, the membranes aren't shown, but you can kind of imagine the visceral pleura would be coating the surface of the lung itself. So it's a really thin, delicate layer that covers the entire surface of the lung. And then the parietal pleura comes out and it lines the body wall. And then in between them, is where we have the space or a nice coating, a nice layer of pleural fluid. Moving on in the thoracic cavity, we said that on either side of the thoracic cavity, we have the pleural cavities and the lungs. The area in between the lungs, right, the area in the middle is referred to as the mediastinum or mediastinum. And just look at that word, right? Look at this first part here. It looks very similar to the word medial. And if you remember from your directional terms, medial is towards the midline of the body. The mediastinum or mediastinum is the area in the middle, right along the midline. So this area here in between the lungs is referred to as the mediastinum. Now, the superior mediastinum, which superior is like the top, has a lot of kind of random structures passing through it. And then the inferior portion, or the bottom of the mediastinum, houses the pericardial cavity. So let's just really quickly talk about the superior mediastinum, and then we'll talk about the pericardial cavity. In the superior portion, we have a lot of really large blood vessels that are going in and out of the heart, because the heart, remember, is right down here. So there's large vessels, like this is the superior vena cava, dumping blood into the heart. There's the aorta, which is a huge artery bringing blood out of the heart. All of the big vessels that are attached to the top of the heart are present in that superior mediastinum. The trachea is also present. The trachea is the windpipe or the air pipe that brings air down into the chest. The esophagus passes through. The esophagus is a tube that brings food from the throat down to the stomach. The thymus is also present. The thymus is a lymphatic organ where some of our immune system cells go to mature. So there's structures from all different body systems. We've got the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, the digestive system, and the lymphatic system. So a lot of kind of randomness. Then in the inferior or the bottom portion of the mediastinum, we have another body cavity, the pericardial cavity. Again, cardio means heart, so the pericardial cavity is the cavity around the heart. So again, the heart is located within the pericardial cavity, and you guys know that there should be another serous membrane here, and the serous membrane is called the pericardium. The pericardium. Just like with the pleura, the pericardium has two layers, the visceral layer and the parietal layer. If you look here at this picture, you can see the heart itself in the center. And then this layer that's kind of peeled back, that's showing you the parietal pericardium. So this, and there's also a strong fibrous pericardium that forms like the strong part of the sac, but don't worry about that right now. We'll do that in A&P2 when we do cardiovascular. So this right here, again, we're pulling back the parietal pericardium, and then the visceral pericardium is a really thin, delicate layer that's actually on the surface of the heart. If you look at this picture here, you can see the way that the two layers are associated with each other. Again, the visceral pericardium is the inner layer that actually touches the surface of the heart. And then that curves around to form the parietal pericardium. And that's the one that's going to be lining the strong, like the strong wall that's protecting the heart. You'll notice the space between the two layers is the pericardial cavity. And what do you guys think we fill this space with? Do you think it's empty, filled with air, solid, filled with fat, what? Hopefully you guys said that that is filled with serous fluid, or in this case we could call it pericardial fluid. And what is that fluid there for? Lubrication. Okay. Now we're going to move down below the diaphragm. And remember, below the diaphragm, we have the abdominopelvic cavity. So above the diaphragm is the thoracic cavity. Below the diaphragm is the abdominopelvic cavity. Now, the abdominopelvic cavity is then further separated into multiple cavities. On the next slide, we'll see the abdominal cavity and then the pelvic cavity. But within the abdominopelvic cavity, there's another kind of like subcavity or another like sac that's covered or surrounded by a serous membrane. We refer to this area as the peritoneal cavity. So the peritoneal cavity is a chamber within the abdominopelvic cavity. Now the peritoneal cavity goes through most of the abdomen, and then it dips down and goes through part of the pelvic cavity. But it doesn't cover or doesn't include every organ that's present in the abdomen or the pelvic cavity. The peritoneal cavity is associated with the serous membrane, again called the peritoneum, and that has two layers. So the parietal peritoneum is the outer layer that lines the body wall. So that's lining the internal body wall, like the inside of our abdominal wall, where your abs are, where your abdominal muscles are. The inside of that abdominal wall is lined with the parietal peritoneum. Then the parietal peritoneum curves around and forms the visceral layer. The visceral peritoneum is the inner layer that actually covers the organs themselves, right? So this lines the organs that are present in the peritoneal cavity. And this includes a lot of different digestive organs or organs that are part of the digestive tract, like the intestines, for example. This visceral peritoneum actually forms something called the serosa, and the serosa is the outermost layer of the GI tract, the digestive tract. Now, of course, this is only present in parts of the digestive tract that are down in the peritoneal cavity. So parts of the digestive tract, like the esophagus, for example, that's up here in the thoracic cavity. So that does not have this visceral peritoneum or serosa present. Now, I said that the peritoneal cavity does not include all organs in the abdomen. There are some organs in the abdomen and in the pelvis that are not included in the peritoneal cavity. The space that's present behind the peritoneal cavity is referred to as the retroperitoneal space. Retro as in behind or posterior to the peritoneal space, the peritoneum. So this retroperitoneal space, again, is the area posterior to or behind the peritoneum and anterior into the muscular body wall. So this is like saying behind the peritoneum and in front of the muscular wall, the back of the back. So let's look at this really quick. This picture right here, this is the front of the body. Okay, so like this is the belly, your abdominal muscles. And this is the back of the body. So this body wall, these are your back muscles. The peritoneal cavity is in the front. So all of this in yellow, this is all showing you the peritoneal cavity. Again, there's a lot of digestive organs in there. A lot of your digestive tract is present in that peritoneal cavity. But notice that the peritoneum, right, the membrane that surrounds this does not go all the way back to the back, right? It stops. And then all this back here, this entire area in the back, that's the retroperitoneal space. That's the space that has some organs that are not included in the peritoneal cavity. So, for example, the pancreas, the kidneys, which are in your lower back, the ureters, these are the tubes that carry urine down into the bladder. Some parts of the digestive tract are located retroperitoneally, right, or behind the peritoneal cavity. In this picture that we were just looking at, these, for example, are your kidneys. So you notice that your kidneys are located right up against the muscular wall of the back, right? And they're in the retroperitoneal space. They're outside of the peritoneal cavity. In this picture here, don't get confused because it's kind of flip-flopped. This is the front of the picture right here. These are, excuse me, these are what you can see is like your abdominal muscles, right? And the body wall comes around, and then you've got these back muscles back here. So this is the back. You can see this shows you a little bit better. It shows you like kind of the space of the peritoneal cavity. So there's the layer, the parietal peritoneum that lines the body wall, and then it curves in, and the visceral layer covers the organs themselves. So the visceral layer, it's kind of complex, like as it wraps around. So it wraps around here, the visceral layer wraps around here, right? And then you notice the space in between those two layers. So all this space, this space, this space, that's all of the peritoneal cavity. The area back behind the peritoneal cavity, so this is retroperitoneal. When you look at this picture over here, the peritoneal cavity is like inside this red line. So you see it covers most of the stuff in the abdominal cavity, and then it drops down and it covers some stuff down in the pelvic cavity, but not everything. Now, the abdominopelvic cavity, we said, could also be separated into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity, and these are a little bit easier to understand than the peritoneal cavity. The abdominal cavity, the abdominal portion, is the superior or the top portion of the abdominopelvic cavity. It's from the diaphragm, which, remember, the diaphragm was this big dome-shaped muscle. So the abdominal cavity extends from the diaphragm down to the top of the pelvic bones or the top of the hip bones. So it's all of this that you see in light blue. That's the abdominal cavity. And it contains most of the digestive organs. So the organs involved in digestion would include things like the stomach, most of the small intestine, the liver, the pancreas, parts of the large intestine. Okay, most digestive organs are present in the abdominal cavity. Just the very end of the digestive tract goes down into the pelvic cavity. The pelvic cavity then is just the inferior portion or the bottom portion. It's the area that's located within the pelvic bones or within the hips. And this contains the reproductive organs. So in men, this would be like the prostate gland, the seminal glands. In women, this would include things like the uterus and the ovaries. It also includes the rectum. The rectum is the very end of the GI tract. So this is like the last 5 inches or so of the GI tract where the feces or poop goes before it exits the body. And then also the urinary bladder where our urine is stored. All right, guys, that is it. Hopefully you are super comfortable with the body cavities. Our next discussion, we'll go ahead and talk about some other ways that we can divide up the abdominopelvic region. Thank you so much. Shoot me an email if you have any questions.